Hey, Mr. Wolf.
Thanks for the ride.
It was my $20.
Hey, hold on a second, will you? Piece of shit.
The funny thing about genre names is that they often do a woefully inadequate job of describing the gameplay of a game. In some cases it's because the genre name doesn't properly describe gameplay elements, such as action adventure, which is used to describe everything from Tomb Raider to Grand Theft Auto. In other cases, it's because particular games simply transcend existing labels, and the latter is definitely the case with Kingpin: Life of Crime. It's a first-person shooter, but that barely describes the game at all. You play as a nameless thug out for revenge against a chap called Nicky, whose men gave the protagonist a beating and left him for dead in the introductory cutscene. That's really the entire story. It's a pretty trite revenge tale, and this isn't a game you should play for its story, but the total absence of information actually makes it pretty compelling, though the story fails to deliver any real revelations. There's some pretty good writing and believable voice acting, but overall the game does the typical thing of just doing enough story to give your character motivation and absolutely nothing more. The game is set in what the game's manual describes as a past that never was, being an urban ghetto infused with Art Deco. You begin with nothing but a lead pipe and half your health missing, having taken the beating I just mentioned, and you're immediately introduced to the most striking thing about the game. Not everyone is an enemy. This is a game where many of the characters the player meets are neutral. Some will sell the player things or offer up information, others offer missions, some mandatory and some optional, and others still will work for the player as hired muscle. Even certain NPCs who can only be described as enemies are neutral until you piss them off by entering their turf or drawing a weapon in their presence. And this gives the game a very immersive feel, especially coupled with the non-linear level design. You can interact with the NPCs using a simple positive and negative system, but you can't have actual conversations. The stuff you say is kind of gibberish. Things match tonally. If you're friendly, the NPC is likely to be friendly. But the actual content of your speech and the NPC's response have virtually no relation. For instance, you might walk up to a guy and use your positive speech on him, and this may trigger your character to ask, "What's all the commotion?" To which the NPC might respond that the streets aren't safe anymore. And these weird disjointed sentences are all you've got for the most part. So it's a bit silly, but that being said, this isn't a conversation simulator. The NPC interaction exists as a mechanism through which you pick up missions and hire thugs and stuff like that. The mechanic never goes beyond its simple, basic presence, but it does its job, and its mere presence in the game is great. The level design is very interesting. There are 39 levels in the game, but each level is very small. They're split into what you might call chapters, with a number of levels in each chapter. But while the chapters are played sequentially, the levels aren't, at least not all the time. Each chapter has a central hub, usually a bar, with a number of little levels around it. Each chapter has a main objective, which usually requires some back and forth between these little levels, completing various lesser objectives before finally moving on to the next hub. The game is occasionally guilty of not making clear what you're supposed to do, despite the journal system, and some of the levels are annoyingly labyrinthine, but for the most part the non-linear level design is used well. Backtracking through the environment gives the areas a more real-world feel than the linear corridors of other shooters with endless rows of locked doors, and that's something I always appreciate. But the hub-based level design becomes plainly formulaic by the time you get to the third bar, if not sooner. I'm going to quickly illustrate how the game works by describing the first 10 minutes of play. After a little exploration of the starting area, which is shaped more or less like a tuning fork, passing numerous neutral NPCs along the way, you eventually learn that to get out of the area you're in, you need to pass through a gang's turf down the left prong. But you can't possibly do that without a gun. You meet a guy willing to sell you a crowbar for $1, a thug willing to work for you for $10, a guy who runs the pawn shop, and a bum who'll give you something if you can find him something to drink. The pawnshop guy sees that you don't have a gun and offers to give you one in exchange for a machine part he wants in a nearby warehouse over on the right prong. So you head on over to the warehouse, and along the way a woman tells you that you should sneak past the guards when they're distracted by the baseball game on the radio. Taking her advice, you're able to safely stealth your way inside the warehouse. A little exploration, a little platforming, and a little melee combat eventually brings you to this machine part, and along the way you find some booze. You sneak your way out, give the bum the booze, and in exchange he gives you the combination to a safe containing $100, and with this you can buy the crowbar, hire the guy willing to fight for you for $10, and then exchange the machine part for a pistol at the pawn shop. You can then shoot your way through the gang's turf to the first hub area. So in just the first 10 minutes you've done NPC interaction, completed a main plot mission, completed an optional side mission, engaged in melee and gun combat, bought an item from an NPC, hired a companion to fight alongside you, and even done a little stealth. Clearly this game is much more than a mere first-person shooter, at least certainly more than they were at the time of the game's release. In fact, I'd say Kingpin could easily have been a prototype for Escape from Butcher Bay. The pawn shops work in pretty much the same way as all other game shops. You find money in the environment and on enemy corpses. That's important, by the way. If you crouch and use corpses, you can find money on them, and the game doesn't fucking tell you that. And you can spend it on guns, health, armor, ammo, and weapon mods. The weapon mods affect things like rate of fire and stuff like that, and while they add a little more depth to your weapon selection, they don't really make a big impact on the game, as there's still a clear hierarchy of effectiveness amongst the weapons. Shotgun beats pistol, Tommy gun beats shotgun, etc. The combat is pretty standard late 90s stuff, meaning there's little to it besides pointing and shooting. But there are a few things that really stand out, especially how hard it is. Groups of enemies can absolutely slaughter you, and even individual enemies may be a threat, so you often have to coax the AI to come to you so you can ambush them around corners, or even exploit the knockback from some weapons to get enemies stuck climbing the ladders if you're as sneaky as I am. This is a pretty hard game, and you definitely can't play it like your average run and gunner. The game is actually pretty generous with giving you health packs, and you can buy more at the pawn shops, but Kingpin is a game where you'll rarely find yourself with full health. To soften the blow a little, you can hire guys to help you fight. They mostly follow you around and just get in your way in narrow corridors like massive stupid heads, but they prove invaluable in a fight, and it's just fun to have a posse. If you walk into one, you can force him to move backwards out of your way, but if you have a couple of guys in your employ, you'll find that although you can push one out of your way, that one can't push your other hireling out of the way. So you might find navigating these narrow corridors fairly laborious, but Half-Life 2 was hardly any better, was it? You can give them dog commands, which is pretty cool, and although you're reliant on health packs, their health regenerates, but you'll still likely find they die fairly easily. In addition to getting muscle, you can also occasionally pick up guys with special skills, such as a safecracker, which is pretty cool. Standard though it is, the combat has a real thump to it, thanks to the delicious violence. The wound decals that appear on enemy bodies are just brutal, and the enemies leave a trail of blood when they move, which is actually pretty handy as they tend to run away when wounded or outgunned, which is very impressive AI, and you can blow limbs clean off. Kingpin was also one of the first games to really develop the idea of damage locations, and there are a number of areas you can shoot for different effects, and playing into this is the fact that armour is also split up into various locations. So there are definitely some cool, standout things to the combat, but for the most part it's just very standard stuff. And its main appeal is going to be either the difficulty or the violence, both of which I enjoy very much. Kingpin gets better on its concept as much as its execution of that concept much of the time. A lot of the game just isn't all that great. It's good, but it's not great. But the concept is so rich that it doesn't really matter. The game is bursting at the seams with interesting or new things that add a lot to its shooter foundation. Gun and melee combat, non-linear level design, NPC interaction, mandatory and optional missions, a shop system, and occasional light platforming and stealth are all parts of Kingpin. Kingpin is not a great game, but it's over a decade since the game was released, and there's still not a genre name that adequately describes it.
Hey, come back anytime, huh? Thanks for shopping, Pawnomatic.